Good evening and welcome to one and all. It is a pleasure to see so many familiar faces and to see so many new faces. Thank you for joining us. Let me begin with a word of thanks. I want to thank the outstanding members of our planning committee and the outstanding members of our host committee, as well as the members of our Yoval committee for putting this program together tonight. As you know, this evening's event is part of a year of active listening at the Jewish Center, and we invite you to join us on any or all of the outstanding programs that are upcoming. Let me begin this special program tonight on Martin Luther King weekend by sharing a couple of public service announcements. Let me just remind everyone that everyone is muted, but our chat is open. You can insert questions into the chat. You can address questions directly to our moderator, Rabbi Hartstark, and we've allotted time at the end of tonight's program to address some of those questions from the audience. We're in the midst now, as you know, of the parshiot that take us through the Exodus. And one of the guiding principles that animates how we remember the story of the Exodus is V'yigadah L'bincha, the mitzvah to teach our narrative to the next generation. And as the Gemara tells us, matchil begenut. Like any story, there's a question about where to start. Like if we were giving a course on the history of Israel, so someone would say, oh, let's start with King David. And someone else would say, oh, we should start with Joshua. And someone else might say, we begin in 1917 or 1948. We can understand that there's an argument to be made in favor of a lot of different places to begin. But when it comes to the story of the Jewish people, everyone agrees with the principle, matchil begenut. We don't shy away from the parts of the story that are upsetting or unflattering. In fact, we consider them to be indispensable. And so we're blessed to have with us this evening individuals who have devoted their careers to the holiest work of all, the work of educating our children, the work of training the next generation of Jewish leaders, how to engage with the complexities of our past and present. If we were all together in one room this evening rather than on Zoom, I would pause now and ask for a round of applause for our day school educators. You can certainly cheer on Zoom by using the little Zoom cheering function. But on behalf of the entire community, let me say to every teacher out there, thank you for all that you've done and all that you continue to do for our children. If ever we failed to appreciate you enough in the past, rest assured, we appreciate you now and we are forever in your debt. Tonight, we're so happy to have with us 4 outstanding pedagogues. I think I tried to count, they have like 22 graduate degrees among them, roughly speaking. It's a pleasure to tell you a drop about each of them. Dr. Lisa Cohen has been teaching social studies at the Abraham Joshua Heschel High School since it opened in 2002 and has served as department chair since 2006. She earned a PhD in Jewish history with a focus on Jews of Tsarist Russia from Yale University and worked for 3 years in the research department of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. Dr. Yehuda Bernstein is the history department chair of the Ramaz Upper School. He teaches contemporary history, the history of Zionism, among other topics. In 2017, he received his PhD in history and Hebrew Judaic studies from New York University, where he wrote a thesis on Zionists in the United States in the early 20th century. Mr. Eitan Kastner is the history department co-chair of the Frisch School. He earned his bachelor's from the honors program at Yeshiva College, where he served as the editor-in-chief of the student newspaper, The Commentator. He then earned his master's in the social sciences from the University of Chicago with a focus on American religious history. And he's been teaching at the Frisch School for more than 10 years. And finally, it's a pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, our moderator tonight, Rabbi Tilly Hartstark. Rabbi Hartstark is the founding principal of SAR High School. He previously served as the rabbi of Congregation Keter Torah in Teaneck and as the associate principal of Judaic Studies at SAR. Rabbi Hartstark is the co-founder of Davar, a unique learning community in Teaneck. He was a fellow at the Tikva Center for Law and Jewish Civilization at NYU Law School in 2010. And in 2017, He was the recipient of the Covenant Award for Excellence in Jewish Education. Rabbi Hartstark, it's a pleasure at this time to turn things over to you and to ask you to lead us the rest of the way.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Levine, and good evening, everyone. I want to begin by expressing gratitude to Ora, to Adina, to the entire Yovel team for coordinating and planning this really very important series, and to our panelists for joining and for sharing of themselves this evening. As you begin, I'd like to take a moment to frame tonight's discussion. Tonight's program is one event, as you know, in a carefully considered year-long series of events developed specifically for the Jewish Center, an Orthodox Jewish community. The Jewish Center community is engaging in conversations about race and racism, doing the difficult work of balancing multiple competing realities and inviting all of us to participate in the conversation. The motivation at its core is to become more educated about issues of race and racism. With the help of a DEI, diversity, equality, and inclusion consultant, who is herself a person of color, the Yovel team developed a program that includes many voices of color in addition to authoritative voices within our community. The focus of tonight's discussion is one crucial element in this project, exploring how we are educating about racism in our yeshiva day school system. The day school is a remarkable nexus where generations meet, where family and school, teacher and student, Jewish and general texts, values, and traditions come together in conversation. Tonight's program provides a space for internal communal conversation about what is happening and what is changing in our schools. Our Jewish values of human dignity, Tzelem Elokim, building just society, make this an essential discussion for our community. We are privileged, as Rabbi Levine said, to have three individuals who are uniquely positioned to best engage our community in genuine internal conversation about what we are doing well, questions that we must consider, and where we can improve. I do want to note that we are talking, although we have representatives of three very distinguished institutions, and we are going to be talking about the programming and curricular work that's happening within those schools. This is not a space for addressing individual school policies. As Rabbi Levine mentioned, you are welcome to put questions into the chat throughout the program. We will begin with each panelist having 3 or 4 minutes to describe some of what's happening in their respective classrooms and more broadly, informally in their schools. Our panelists will then engage with each other, we'll ask some questions, and then towards the end, we will take questions from the chat and pose that to the panel as well. So let's get started. I'd like to ask each of you, please, to describe, as I said, in 3 to 4 minutes, what you and others in your respective schools within the school culture are doing both formally in the classroom and informally in the school to teach about issues of racism. I think for this one, it's okay, I'll ask Yehuda, and if we can all be on first name basis for this program if you guys are comfortable. So if Yehuda, you can get us going, and then Lisa and Eitan. Thank you.
Hi, totally, if I'm not coming through clearly, just let me know, okay? I'd like to thank everyone for having me here. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here tonight. What is Ramaz doing in the upper school to teach about racism and issues of race relations? I have to say, even before the most recent unrest in the summer over the tragic killing of George Floyd, the Ramaz Upper School, in the history department at least, I feel actually covers racism pretty well. And by that I mean, the 9th grade goes up to roughly the 18th century, and it spends a lot of time on issues of early imperialism and the Middle Passage and the slave trade. The 10th grade focuses on the modern era and spends a really large amount of time on issues of slavery in the United States, the sectionalism crisis, Civil War, shortcomings of Reconstruction. The 11th grade, 20th century, which I teach 4 sections of, we spend a real large chunk of the year talking about Jim Crow laws and the terror of lynching and the disparities of New Deal wealth redistribution, Civil Rights Act vote. I mean, we spend a lot of time on this. I think that one thing that the George Floyd tragedy and the larger event of the summer highlights is that learning in the classroom is only a beginning, and it almost feels like it's just not quite enough. For us, for the teachers in our department, it wasn't a question of, like, how do we change the curriculum to better focus on this, because we were already devoting time. It was more of a question of emphasis and doing things outside of the classroom. One major initiative that we've been doing since we returned from the summer is the history department has been hosting a racism or anti-racism club, which is a student forum for discussion, which all students are invited to and all teachers are invited to, where we talk about issues of race and racism historically and in the news. We've had like 6 meetings so far, and that's a nice way to get students to kind of start to express things that they hear about or things that they're concerned about. I think that's been a nice, really informal setting, but I don't want to take up any more time. I want to pass it off to my colleagues and hear what they have to say too.
Thank you, Lisa.
I very much appreciate being included this evening and being part of this group. I'd like to kind of sketch out what Heschel has done since the killing of George Floyd and the protests that began in the late spring. And there was a good deal of kind of pivoting to address it that went on an institutional level, speaking for the high school. There were some full school programs, speakers who were brought in ranging from the academic to the more inspirational, and then processing of those programs that went on not only in social studies, but in all classes, regardless of department. Of course, because we were on Zoom, there was greater flexibility. We were all constantly adjusting and shifting anyway, so it really was quite easy to make that change and to have more of this current events focus. Our department also started right away thinking about what changes we might want to make that might be appropriate. I would agree, and I won't go into it right now, but I would agree with what Yehuda was saying, that there are many elements in our curriculum that relate to issues of slavery, issues of race. The question was, how can we do this better? So one change we made immediately was to change our 11th grade summer reading book from a book that an excellent novel about the aftermath of World War I to Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns, which is a very masterful presentation of the Great Migration. And one of my colleagues here put it on the suggested reading list, and I highly recommend it. The summer readings are a wonderful common foundation that then those classes can draw on throughout the year. We also met a great deal as a department over the summer, again, to review what we're doing and think about not just the question of where might we include more material, but again, how are we approaching it? How might we reframe some of our essential questions? How do we make sure that we're not only looking at majority culture toward minority culture? How do we make sure that what we have going on is an organic inclusion, which is an approach we want to take, whether we're talking about issues of race, gender, religion, et cetera. But also, how do we strike appropriate balances between the various lenses that we want to use? In terms of the institution as a whole, at the beginning of the summer, the administration established a faculty and staff anti-racism task force with branches in each division. In the high school, one subcommittee has been developing a 6-part anti-racism program to be facilitated by faculty subcommittee members. Well, that part's with students. That's going to be led by faculty members. We'll be meeting with students in their pods. The other committee has been developing the programming for the faculty, both for their own growth and development, and to provide some training for running the programs with students, with the understanding that none of us are experts in this, but that we'll, to a certain extent, be peers in doing this work. And we continue, in addition to what goes on in our classrooms, as an institution, we now have twice weekly Zoom ASEFA programs. And a number of those have been devoted to issues relating to poverty, wealth inequity. One thing that's been particularly lovely has been the way that students have stepped up, and those members of our Jewish and Student Life Committee who work with students have helped them to help us plan. And on a number of occasions, students have been speaking at those assemblies with remarkable maturity. So that is my overview, and I turn it over to you, Eitan.
Thank you, Lisa, and I'd like to echo my colleagues' gratitude. Thank you so much for inviting me. I think this is a wonderful opportunity. So at Frisch, I can talk about this in a few different ways. As the co-chair of the history department, we revamped our entire history curriculum starting around 5 years ago. And one of our overarching goals in doing so was to include more people of color, a wider view of history than what we had been teaching prior. So in the 9th grade, we teach a larger world and Jewish history combined course going to around the Renaissance. Include more units on China, India, Africa, Indigenous Americas during that time than we had prior. And then in the 10th grade, we continue the world and Jewish history curriculum through from the 16th century through the present. And then in the 11th grade, where I do most of my teaching, we have a 1-year United States history curriculum. Teaching all of United States history in 1 year is a very challenging thing to do, but it's also sort of liberating because we can't teach everything. So once you can't teach everything, you really get to decide what you're focusing on, what you can't focus on. And so we have made it our mission to ensure that one of the dominant themes we discuss in our United States history curriculum in 11th grade is focusing on issues of race and slavery throughout United States history. And then finally, in the senior year, all of our history courses are electives, and many of them touch upon issues of race in one way or another. We actually offer a history of African American elective. Even in the elective that I teach, which is art history, I included just this year a month-long unit on African art, which touched upon art of African Americans in America as well. And so in many ways, we try and broaden the horizons of our students. From a school perspective, we've also been very attentive to this ever since the springtime. We had assemblies after the George Floyd murder, and tomorrow is Martin Luther King Day. We're having a school-wide event where in our history class, our English class, our Talmud class, our Chumash classes, we are addressing issues of race in America to properly commemorate Martin Luther King Day. And then lastly, from a student perspective, our students are really interested in this, and they know they don't know the things they should know. They know that they want to know more. They know how important this issue is to be educated citizens in America. And so a lot of things come from themselves. We have a student-generated anti-racism club. They meet regularly. They have a faculty liaison. They asked me to present a few weeks ago about just what is structural racism and how can we understand these things. There's a student progressive club. We have one student who's helped found a local Black Lives Matter movement in his town. And so a lot of things come from the students themselves, which is as an educator, so refreshing to see them becoming interested. And so that's a very quick overview of where Frisch is right now.
Thank you, all of you. It's clear that you are all working very hard and being very deliberate, not only in terms of what you teach, but to make sure that you are reconsidering all the time what and how it is that you are teaching. I'm wondering if you can share with us some of the challenges of doing this kind of work, because it clearly is contentious, complex in so many ways. What you've described so far is the good work that you are doing. Can you share with us some of the difficulties, some of the challenges, what makes it tough? And I am certainly interested in how much there will be overlap and difference between the challenges you confront in your respective schools. Yehuda, you can start us off again, and maybe we'll go the other way. Eitan, you can respond to what Yehuda has to say. Go.
I think that the most difficult challenge, which I think really calls for inter-school collaboration and some sort of larger, more extended discussion, is a challenge which is endemic to Jewish day schools, and that's that these are spaces which are predominantly white. I think that a lot of these schools, Ramaz and I'm sure others, have made great strides in recent years in making it more Jewishly diverse. It's not as Ashkenazi heavy as it once was. There are students from a lot of different geographic backgrounds and different families, but in the American context, this is just what it is. It's almost just a fact. That's not to say that there aren't Jews of color. There are, but this is the challenge for our schools, is getting our students not just to learn about issues of race and racism and to talk about it, which it sounds like we all do quite well and we're all sensitive to. The challenge is, how do you create forums for them to actually meet people of color, learn from people of color? I think that there's 1,000 ways that schools can meet these challenges without it being cheap or sort of tokenizing. I know at Ramaz, we've already broached these discussions, and the creation of that club, which I mentioned, was initially supposed to be a first stab at it, and then COVID kind of threw all of our plans into the wastebasket. But it's on our minds of how can we move beyond just talking and actually get into relationship building. But it could also involve a more concerted commitment to hire people of color, which I think is something of an issue too on faculty staff. But to me, in my mind, that is without a doubt the big issue, which I think we can all work on together. But yeah.
Do you think our program can support that, given the dual curriculum and everything else that's going on? It's a little bit of a technical more than but what are the trade-offs in your mind in trying to do something like that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'd love to hear what my colleagues think about that. I think, I don't know. It's a question of priorities, I suppose. There are things in my mind which are more immediately doable, which don't require much sacrifice. Something as small as having athletic clubs not just play in the Yeshiva League. I mean, that's like an obvious, like easy, like low-hanging fruit sort of thing. But then there's bigger things, which, I suppose I would have to defer to upper administration, which blessedly I am not one. But, I'm curious what my colleagues have to say.
So our issues are very similar, similarly, we are predominantly a white school. We do indeed have Jews of color in Frisch, but they are a very significant minority. And the fear of addressing this without leading to tokenization is something we discuss and think about all the time. It is a very real concern that we try and bring up. There's no easy solution. The idea of adding things to anything we do, it's a sort of a zero-sum game. If you're adding time in one way, you're taking it from someone else, something else, and that is indeed a concern. But certainly in the history department, this is a growing issue that we are passionate about, of making sure that our students are exposed to everything they need to be exposed to become good citizens of this country. And fortunately, the students want it as well. So that makes it much, much easier. Yes, that's, I want to echo what you had to say.
So I will second all that you both said. One slight angle I'd like to add, I think, to Yehuda's opening comments is as well, because our students are at a predominantly white school and move in predominantly white circles outside, they themselves have not really witnessed or brushed up against people who have experienced some of the systemic racism that we want them to recognize. So before getting to the interaction and relationships for a moment, just to say that there are challenges in trying to to help them understand what such a thing as systemic racism, discrimination based on skin color looks like. And because it is removed from their own experience, and because their life experience has still been relatively short at this point in time, that is definitely an obstacle we're already encountering. And I guess I'm a little less sanguine than you seem to be, Yehuda, about how there being so many possible ways in which you might create opportunities to build relationships. I think partly based on our experience, say, with a kind of on again, off again over the years, Interfaith Club, trying to enable our students to meet students from a Catholic school, from a program we participated in for just a few years, in which a small number of seniors, with a great deal of preparation, met a small number of Muslim students. But to create something that does not feel kind of art forced, and to think, we would love our students to have this relationship, but why necessarily would schools with more diverse populations, what is in it for them, and what would their motivation be? So I do not have.
I'm wondering, so far, there seems to be common agreement on the importance of trying to move in such a direction, but not sure what it would take to make that happen and some of the complications of doing that. I'm wondering whether in your sense there would be general agreement with your own sentiments about the importance of doing something like that, or is there disagreement within your school community, both among faculty, among the families, parents, or is your sense that moving in such a direction, were it possible, if we had all the time in the world in a school day to be able to do that, that's the direction that we should head, or is it more contentious than that within the community?
If I may, I might just mention, I can't claim to really have my finger on the pulse of the whole community around this question, but in the late spring, early summer, 2 letters/petitions were written, one coming from alumni and one coming from current students, with a list of very respectfully phrased letters expressing some changes they would like to see. And I would say that in both cases, please help us build relationships with people beyond our community was one of the central desires they expressed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I should say.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that? Yeah. I
encountered similar sorts of opinions among alumni too. I think that I too, it would be presumptuous of me to say that I know what the Ramaz Upper School parent body wants, what their priorities are, what they don't want. I do think that there are a lot of administrators at Ramaz who did see the summer as something which should spur greater thoughtfulness and greater call to action. And there was a lot of dialogue among faculty in the summer about what can be done. So I do think that there is a kind of wellspring of interest in tackling this issue, even if it's in ways which end up failing. I do agree with Lisa that even though I might have sounded sanguine, it's a huge challenge. It's just a question of initiative and coming up with some good ideas and being willing to experiment and fail a lot in search of things that work. But I do think out there are lots of people who are bothered by events of the past few years and are interested in seeing some sort of change.
For a school that is as homogenous as Frisch is from an outsider's perspective, we do have a good amount of internal diversity. We're a relatively large school, so if there are 2 opinions on something, they are both expressed within our parent body. And so that said, I could certainly say a not insignificant portion of the Frisch community would appreciate such a move. Again, I can't speak for everyone, and I'm sure it wouldn't be met with universal approval, but I think there would be a sizable portion that would appreciate such a move within the community.
Mm-hmm. But it's not your sense that there is, in your experience, the tension. I mean, one of the questions that I wanted to ask you about was the balance between home and school in terms of educating about race. I've certainly heard educators share with me that the attitudes in this regard very much come from the home, and that there is some impact that teachers can have in a classroom, but when it comes to something like this, it's difficult. And I am wondering still whether you have felt that kind of tension, or in general, how do you think about the relationship between school and home regarding views on race in America? Whoever wants to jump in.
So I'll jump in. It's interesting. I view that in a few different ways. Students often parrot what their parents say, but that doesn't mean they necessarily believe it. In that, I've had a lot of students that really don't know what they think yet. I've had a number of students that I've taught as freshmen, and by the time they're seniors, they might be quite different. I mean, hopefully they are. And even more so, a number of graduates have come back to me later and said, I definitely thought this one way back in sophomore year, but I see things differently now. So while indeed students do get a lot from the home, they're open to learning new things. I have a few students that have very prominently placed Trump bumper stickers on the back of their laptops, but they're, very open-minded to all sorts of ideas. And similarly, I have a number of students who have other affiliations on their clothes or on their laptops, and still they're not quite as intense as you might think. They're supposed to be somewhat open-minded in high school, and I find most of my students fit that bill. So while they certainly do, of course, things from the home make an impact on them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's who they immediately are at that moment. I mean, if kids always turned out the way their parents were, the 60s would have been very, very different.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And do you find that the conversations when you're teaching actually in the classroom, is there, again, so far you've described general openness, and it almost sounds like it is, there's a lot of general agreement, I guess, in the classroom when they were studying about this. And I want to check on that, see, is that really the case? Maybe interested in looking under the hood a little bit on that front. Lisa?
I would say in my classes, I am finding that people are not all of one mind. There is definitely a range of opinion. And if you don't mind, I'd like to add one piece to what Eitan was just talking about as well. And I would broaden the question then to think whether it need not necessarily be issues of race, but any controversial and politicized issue that might come up in the classroom. I think what's so important is that we're modeling how to discuss it. This is where the idea of modeling civil discourse and how we can be in the same classroom and have different ideas, then it's very incumbent upon us as educators to very carefully moderate the conversation. This is where we're best preparing them to be able to go out into the world and be citizens who participate in civic discussion the way we'd like them to. So that to me is more important than whether they necessarily come out looking at things a particular way, and also to do the very delicate balancing act of letting them see that there's a difference. And here I do feel I concur with, and I'm trying to, in my own words, voice something that comes out of Heschel from the top of the administration to demonstrate where we're talking about policies, and it's fine that we differ on policies. We may have different opinions in the room about affirmative action, but then also where we cross a boundary and kind of what some bottom lines are about some perspectives and about how you go about discussing all of this in an evidence-based way.
Yeah, I very much concur with my colleagues. I think I very much concur with Lisa that one thing we can really invest in the students is an ability to talk through hot button issues in a way that's sober and careful and respectful, to moderate discussion. I think all of that is great. I have not seen in the parent body yet, at least, any evidence that race is a real hot button issue. In fact, I haven't seen the parent body take all that much controversial interest in anything the history department is teaching in a nitty-gritty way, which is a good thing, I think. But I do think that another thing we can do, and which I'm sure all of us do at our respective institutions, one of the great gifts we can offer students when they get into the world is to be able to think of race in a historical way. I really think that this is absolutely crucial, and it comes up in our department from freshman year all the way through senior year, is to get them to understand that race is not a fixed category. It's something that's invented by humans. It's a perspective on the world. The way that humans see it in a given time is shaped by cultural and economic and social circumstances. And things which seem to be fixed in one era all of a sudden are forgotten in a different era. And I think that idea, it ameliorates some of the passions around this in the present debate. And it's something which can't be emphasized enough because it's a really complicated idea, but this idea that it shifts over time. So we stress that a lot, and it's hard to know how much students assimilate that. I agree they do get a lot of this from the home, but I also agree with Eitan, they get a lot of it from school, and I do agree that they're open to learning all sorts of things, and often they're trying out things in the classroom to see how teachers respond, and that's a good thing. I think that's the sort of forum we should be providing for them. But
you've mentioned in the past round, we talked about the importance of civil discourse, being able to talk about issues that we feel passionate about, ways that are respectful. Can one of you point to an example of an issue about which students actually do get passionate about in a kind of concrete and specific way? Can I put you on the spot to say, like, here's something that's happened in class where kids really get divided around this? And what is that, what's the example and what does that look like in the class? What are they kind of battling with each other about?
I'll begin. I teach a survey of Zionism to the seniors, an honors course. And I do see that when it comes to Zionism, they have far more strident beliefs about Zionism, not necessarily consistently in one direction or another, but their opinions are far more strident than I see when it comes to their views about, a topic in US history in the 20th century of one or another. And that makes sense, right? I mean, they get so much more exposure to Zionism and discussions about it and the politics of it even than I think they do to other topics.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that one?
Sure. So over the course of the 11th grade United States history curriculum, we start setting the stage for discussing the concept of systemic racism. And a number of my students are very actively engaged in listening to different podcasts and reading different journals and things like newspapers and things like that. So they often are exposed to different contemporary ideas. And the idea of systemic racism makes some students very uncomfortable. The idea of privilege makes some students very uncomfortable. And they don't yet have a sophisticated enough understanding of these concepts to fully figure out how they feel about them. And so I have had instances in class of students respectfully hearing each other out, understanding the different sides of the issue, I'm not saying I don't think anyone convinced anyone else that they were incorrect, but that never happens anyway. The idea of privilege and systemic racism is definitely an issue that makes some students very uncomfortable.
I would agree with both of you. Just about anything that has to do with Israel will be passionate. I agree also, there is something very visceral when you get to the issue of systemic racism, and you have again, a very passionate reaction. And I would add to that, even without connecting it to issues of race, some current events conversations that have had to do with issues of wealth inequity have also clearly touched something very, very deep for students.
So picking up on that, I'm curious about the relationship between your personal views then on matter of race and what you present, how you present that to your students. If privilege and systemic racism and Israel are categories that, as you described in the different reactions in those areas, I'm sure that someone can formulate why it is that that's true. Someone might say, my commitment to Israel is stronger, and that's where my attention goes. Or I'm not sure that privilege, I don't quite think about it that way. Systemic racism is an arguable issue to me. How do you think about or distinguish between what I guess it's a two-pronged question. On the one hand, it's how do you bring your personal views into the classroom? I guess I would ask that as, I'll start with that. I have two parts of the question. Maybe I'll start with that. Do you bring how do you manage your own personal views and the classroom setting, specifically in terms of this issue, the racism issue? Lisa?
So I appreciate what I'm experiencing as increasing clarity, again, from our administration about certain issues. Again, the existence of systemic racism isn't something that we're treating as an opinion that anybody is bringing into the classroom, but rather as a reality. And again, we can differ then on what that means anybody should or shouldn't need to do about that. So as I was saying before, there's a need to, or the idea that race is not a scientifically, biologically valid category, regardless of its very, indeed its great reality as a lived experience in our society. So it's distinguishing between the two. When it comes to then differences of opinion about what needs to be done, what should be done, what people have been doing and how we view them, that's where we need to go into the same mode we would go in around any other controversial topic in moderating the discussion.
Eitan, you're gonna say?
So this question is probably the number one question I struggle with. If I could tell a brief story, when I was a junior in Frisch, I had a teacher who was very outspoken with his own political views, and it made me as a junior just profoundly uncomfortable. And I swore to myself, when I replace you one day, I will never do that. Which of course I did end up replacing him. And it's not my place to tell the students what to think politically in general. Obviously there are certain lines like Lisa mentioned before, like there are certain things that are facts, not opinions, but it's my job to have them figure out what they think themselves and how to ascertain the validity of a source and how to understand different perspectives on an issue and how to understand a source's intended audience and all these super important skills that go well beyond the history classroom. That said, when I'm teaching things that, I particularly know a lot about or that I have very strong feelings, it is hard to remove myself from that entirely. It's a big challenge, but I think it's worth struggling with because being in front of the classroom is not a soapbox. It's not my turn to have them understand my inner workings of my political ideas. That said, there are things where students, again, because they're young, might have childish notions of things or erroneous understandings of things. And that's a time to help them understand how to see the light, understand things more in a more sophisticated adult way. But it's certainly not my job to teach them what to think about any one topic.
Thanks. And Yuda?
I agree with my colleagues. I too try my hardest not to impose my own political views in the classroom. I even get uncomfortable when students will ask me point blank about a political issue. I try to like have it as a one-on-one conversation as opposed to like me declaring to the whole group, this is what I think. I also struggle with, I do agree that the term structural racism, for those students who know what it is, can be triggering. And if not that, the explanation of it can be triggering. And I struggle sometimes how to deal with that. One example, as I mentioned at the beginning, was when you teach about the New Deal, and there's been a lot of research on how New Deal programs, for all sorts of arcane reasons, distributed the wealth that they were distributing differently to people who were white and people who were black. And this goes all the way through the GI Bill. You could teach that by starting off by saying, here's what structural racism is, here's what it means. And then you get into your topic, or you can just teach the topic, right? And you show like, these are the percentages of people who were able to claim these benefits. These are the percentages of people who were able to buy a home. This is what redlining looked like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When you do it the latter way, the benefit of it is you avoid perhaps triggering some students who are more politicized and on alert. But the drawback is that a lot of other students in the room learn it and they kind of just file it away as a history topic that they learned, similar to something that they learned in science that morning, right? They don't really draw the conclusions about what this means for American life today. And that's a struggle. That's a struggle that, we're all dealing with all the time, how to navigate between those 2 points. I can't say I figured it out, but yeah.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna go to, there are a lot of questions actually have been put into the chat. I want to pose a couple. There are a number of pretty large ones, but so we'll see what we can cover in a couple of minutes. What I'd like to ask first is, do you find that issues of racism, that raising those issues in class have been further complicated as a result of intersectionality discourse, overlap between some anti-racist causes and pro-BDS critics of Israel? That is, I guess, the question specifically as it relates to, schooling, not your conversation out there, but do you find that in the school setting, it makes it, does that impact on the ability to raise those issues? The specific way in which that's lined up with in certain instances, with anti-racist causes and pro-BDS critics of Israel, etc.
Thankfully, I would say the vast majority of our students are not so well versed in the intricacies of these issues, so they don't even know that that's a thing in our community. And while there are certainly students who are very aware, thankfully, I mean, maybe it's just me, I've been lucky, certainly with my students, even students who are aware of that are respectful enough to listen and maybe, again, not to change their minds, but to hear out different ideas in a respectful way or respectfully disagree. It's not certainly not a constant issue when these come up. It's sort of in the back of my head on the day I'm bringing up an issue like this. I'm thinking, what will I do if a student brings something up? But more often than not, it either doesn't happen or it happens in a more subtle, respectful way.
Do you think that they would then be prepared for when they're on a college campus and they're confronted by some of that?
That is a big question. Whenever students return, graduates, I sort of always ask them about that. And maybe it's sort of a self-selecting group, but no graduate has ever said to me, this has been an issue for me. I was unprepared for this. So maybe it's just a small sample size, but that has not been an issue that I have seen.
I agree.
Lisa?
Interestingly, it also, in my experience, I have not personally experienced students raising this, nor have I heard from anybody in my department about students going in that direction. And I think also, you're right, again, they're young enough and they're moving in a particular environment for the most part. And it doesn't seem to be very much on their radar.
So I just want to push on that a little more. So what do you think what's going to happen, 5 years out from now in that regard? Because it's certainly out there. That's a big part of the discourse. So it sounds like you're saying that they've been sheltered from it until now. Or I don't know. I guess I just want to make sure that it's clear. Yehuda?
I agree with my colleagues. I haven't encountered a student who is plugged in enough yet who has said, well, but isn't BLM like this? I agree, it's a potential issue, but I haven't seen it yet. Yeah, I mean, it is something to think about in terms of exposure on college campuses and where politics on the left might be heading. Look, I think one thing that we try to do in the history department here, and I have no doubt my colleagues are doing too in their institutions, is we're trying to teach students to think clearly through things. And, our hope is, it's a modest hope, that we can invest them with analytical tools to be able to say, this portion of a cause is noble and I agree with, but I may not agree with that portion of a cause. And I can differentiate between the two. And that's okay. It's important to live in a world where things are not neat and tidy, but messy. So I don't know what it's like 5 years down the line for those who encounter it. It is something, I suppose, worth further meditation, but yeah.
I might also mention the second half of our senior year, there is something just called the Israel Seminar, in which is, let me back up one step. In the fall of their senior year, though there are electives that they choose from, every senior takes a class in our department that is related to Israel's history in one way or another. There's quite a range. That's kind of the more academic portion of their Israel education of their senior year. Second half of the year, they take an Israel seminar that is designed to look at issues for them to sort through their own personal relationship. I've never actually been part of that. It's staffed primarily by people in our Limudei Kodesh department. A former member of whom is here and perhaps could speak to it better than I can. I'm just then going to mention that there is a forum within which they can do some of that exploration, kind of preparation. I just can't speak to the specifics.
Okay, I want to, one of the questions put in the chat about the New York Times 1619 project, and interested in hearing your thoughts about that. This New York Times, of course, in 2019, began publication of the 1619 project by Nicole Hannah-Jones. So the quote is that the project aims to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the United States' national narrative. As an educator, do you identify with that sentence? Would you support a curricular shift that would place the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the United States national narrative?
I'm happy to speak to the reaction in my department. I think when it first came out, there was kind of a flurry of excitement and a lot of reading it. And as time passed and we discussed in more concrete ways to what extent, in what ways we might work with it, much more of a range of opinion developed. And from someone who did want very much to kind of adopt this. And where we came to as a department, with some insistence on my part that we don't make that front and center, we don't adopt any curriculum wholesale. There are all kinds of curricular units and programs out there, none of which we simply adopt, but we might use selectively. And I'm thinking it could be Facing History or in ourselves. I'm thinking there are materials come out of Brown University called the Choices Program. So the way we're approaching it now is that there might be bits and pieces that we could see using, but not a wholesale adoption of its thesis or adopting all of the curriculum materials that they put together.
Anyone else on that one?
Yeah,
Eitan?
you go ahead.
Yeah, I was following the 1619 project when it was first rolled out, and it was interesting to me too. I agree. It's exciting from educational perspective, even if you don't agree with the entire project, just to see people taking, the studying of history at the high school and college level extremely seriously. The 1619 project is just like any other debate in historiography around US history, which all of our teachers are interested in and try to keep up on. It's a view of history, but it's not an unchallenged view. There have been other eminent historians who have said, well, here's what has been historically sound about the arguments in the project, but here's some things which are a little more questionable. And our teachers keep up on those things. Like Lisa, we don't just adopt something wholesale because the New York Times puts a stamp on it. It's an interesting endeavor, and our faculty have kept up with various parts of it, but it certainly wouldn't just be something we would embrace just because.
Mhm.
Yeah,
There's one. Go ahead, Eitan.
I definitely agree with Lisa and Yehuda with similar ideas. We definitely would not adopt it wholesale. There are aspects of it that are useful. The accompanying podcasts in particular are very helpful, though I haven't assigned them to students. I would, in theory, assign some of them. But the idea that historians can debate these things is a fantastic window into the concept of historiography, which is an idea students find just mind-blowing, that history isn't so clear-cut and easy to understand, that historians can actually disagree about major things and how important and their relative importance. So early in the year, I introduced my students to the debate about the 1619 project, and I think they found that interesting. And also, some of them might have heard about it a little bit. So it served that function, if nothing else, to introduce them to this concept.
Thank you. I'm trying to squeeze one more question in. The question is there a sense, you touched on it very early on, I just want to come back for a moment. Is there a sense in schools that the issues of racism in America is not merely about modeling discourse, but inspiring students to engage in activism? Are schools struggling with or talking about joining forces with the movement currently unfolding across the country? I think that the distinction between modeling discourse and activism feels interesting in terms of where some of our day schools kind of put our weight under, behind, and you kind of like sense the difference as to when we sometimes do a program and when we really put the full weight of the institution behind it. Do you think, what would you think about that distinction? And is there some energy towards engaging actually in activism in a way that is different and kind of stronger, weightier, I guess, than modeling discourse? What do you think is the case, and what do you think should be? That's open to anybody.
I guess I'll chime in. That's a good question. Look, that's the kind of question which would strike me as more of a upper administration question than a history department question. In the history department, it's not that we discourage students from activism, but our primary goal is to invest them with the essential analytical tools that are necessary to learn history well, to understand major debates about the United States and Europe and the world in various eras, and to get them to have a sort of conceptual toolbox that they can use that will suit them in all sorts of academic endeavors when they get to the university level. So I know certainly our history department doesn't necessarily engage in a project of thinking about how to be more active than what goes on in the academic setting. Not that we oppose it, but it seems a little bit beyond our bailiwick.
Okay, Lisa, last word.
Oh. I think one we think sometimes, would we want the ideal Heschel graduate to look like? And one piece would be that they are people who are advocates in the world for the causes that they believe in. So while we aren't, and as Yehuda said, it's certainly not going to be our department that's going to organize any kind of active advocacy. The idea that you need to be active in society on behalf of the causes that you believe in is definitely a clear message. And you said it's the last word. If I may, it was a year or two ago that Susanna Heschel came to speak to us, and she had visited us 2 or 3 times over the course of the existence of the high school. And one of the students asked her in the Q&A section, what message do you think your father would have for us? And she said something along the lines of, go out and work for social justice. So I share that.
That is a very powerful and fitting last word. Thank you, Lisa. I want to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Bernstein, Dr. Cohn, Mr. Kastner. Thank you very much for sharing of yourselves and your experiences. It's great to be with all of you, and I hand it back to Ora. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you so much, all of you, for being here and for sharing with us your expertise and your perspective. I know that there were lots of questions that went unanswered, and we hope that this is only the beginning of a conversation among your school communities, among your families, and among your friends. So we really thank you for being here. If you would like to learn more about Yoval, we have our year of very active listening. We have a full year of programs ahead of us. You can check out our website, and we have upcoming events. Our next event is in just 2 weeks. We're going to be hearing from Rachel Swarns, who is a journalist and teacher at NYU. She's going to be speaking on the topic of reckoning with race and history, continuing our theme of examining history. What does slavery have to do with me? It promises to be an excellent class, and there are processing groups afterwards if you'd like to continue the conversation. So you can register at the link that I just posted in the chat. And then here's a brief overview of the many programs that we have coming up over the course of the year. We're going to be, this is just a quick look, highlights. We're going to be talking about racism and anti-Semitism. We're going to be doing some text study about Jews and race, and we're going to as well hear personal narratives from people sharing a little bit about their lives with us. And we really thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. And we hope to continue learning together. And you will receive a follow-up email tomorrow with opportunity for feedback and reading, continued reading. And thank you so much for joining us. And we hope to continue learning with you soon.